Hello. Today we're here to speak to Angelina Pillai, the CEO of the Association of Consulting Architects, and we're here to discuss the ACA's Pulse Check number 6. Welcome, Angelina.
Thank you, Leigh. Pleasure.
Before we sort of get into detail about the Pulse Check, can we just maybe start off by getting you to give us a bit of background information on the ACA, what you're all about and what the goals of the organisation are?
Oh, absolutely. Look, ACA, we're the designated employer body under the Fair Work Commission. We're mandated to represent the interests of architectural practices here in Australia. So industrial relations sits very much at the core of our charter. And as a result of that, equally critically, our active role supporting practices with the business side of architecture. So not design, the business. And that's through the development of tools and resources, advice, advocacy, including facilitating what I like to call thought leadership discussions like the one we're having today.
Fantastic.
So, we're very committed to supporting the business of architecture as it relates to equitable practice, innovative practice, and fundamentally a commitment to creating and fostering, healthy and vibrant work cultures across the profession. So practices, can attract, they can recruit, they can develop, and they can retain the best talent. And we'll talk, more about the talent issue, but suffice to say, people are very much at the core, at the center of any good practice or any good organisation. So ensuring that practices are equipped to lead and manage them to deliver on the best possible outcomes, it's really critical to the work that we do. So that's the kind of the big picture of who we are.
And the Pulse Check itself, that's where obviously this is the sixth version of this. What's the Pulse Check about? Who are the organisations that are involved, and how many respondents do you get?
Sure. So here at the ACA, our members will know this very well. We're quite partial to checking in with our members. Research matters, and as an industrial relations body, representing the interests of practices, having reliable data to act on is actually really important to the work that we do. So when the first COVID lockdown was announced back in March of 2020, we immediately launched our first Pulse Check survey. Our plan at the time was pretty simple, though, hindsight's a wonderful thing. I don't think we actually had a plan. It was sort of announced on the Friday. Saturday, I had my national president going, we need to do something. We need to find her. So we rolled together a whole series of questions. And what we wanted to know, and this is the thing that we knew we needed to do, was to get a really good understanding of how practices, anticipated at the time being affected by COVID. And we wanted to use those findings to help develop a much clearer grasp of the preparedness of the profession, the preparedness of us as ACA, and what is needed for us to be able to support. And that wasn't just informing the ACA in the work that we're doing, because obviously that's critical, because we needed to know what we needed to do, but it was also going to inform discussions with government through our involvement with the Australian Construction Industry Forum. So that's a national body that represents the kind of the who's who of construction bodies, about the impacts of architecture on the construction industry more broadly, and also conversations with other industry groups. So, by the time we were ready to launch Pulse Check 1, we had a pretty fulsome vision of what we wanted to achieve, and quite successfully, that first Pulse Check garnered about 1,300 responding businesses, totaling almost 13,000 individual staff that made up those businesses. And we knew from the results in Pulse Check 1 that there were some pretty big projects ahead of us to deliver. We were asked to keep up a really good flow of information, provide expert advice and support on a wide range of matters, HR, IR, what does remote working look like, employment issues, contracts, legal. We were also asked, that we needed to really, reconfigure all of our events into online CPD. And quite interestingly too was, we were called upon to act as the platform for practices and the profession to share experiences from other practices to kind of really, support each other. So it was kind of a sense that we're all in this together. So how can we get through this together? It was quite encouraging. And so that's really the genesis of the ACA Pulse Check survey. Since then, we've run 6, as you quite rightly point out, national surveys. We also ran one specifically in Victoria, given the extreme lockdown conditions here. And so, some really good data that started to emerge as a result of that.
So obviously, since COVID, we've had a lot of changes out there in both market, working, well, everything we do really. What has the survey revealed about, I suppose, where the pipeline for practices are, and what sort of areas are busier, or are there areas that are busier than others?
Look, it might be useful in answering that question just to explain kind of the main areas of the survey that we were eliciting data from in order to create, this longitudinal knowledge about the impact of COVID. So, the sectors that practices are working in compared with sectors, say, prior to COVID, was one key area that we were looking at. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. Employment information, so fractions, casual, part-time, full-time, the discipline areas within those practices, obviously architecture is the predominant discipline, but also other areas like planning, urban design, interiors, project management, and so on. We also wanted to work through working arrangements, in particular around flexible hybrid staffing, from increases, decreases, attraction, retention, what are some issues there, and the levels of work and work pipeline. Wellbeing, massively important to us, advocacy priority, and something we introduced in the latest Pulse Check included new sections on opportunities and challenges. We felt that with the shift to a living with COVID world, that there were some positive impacts, and wanted to capture that, and also what practices have learnt, and what the future actually looks like. So yeah, and I think just to your point about sectors. The two sectors that have provided new areas for work for practices during the pandemic continue. So affordable and social housing, and private residential, with small increases also reported in the multi-residential, cultural and community heritage conservation, which I think is not surprising. Especially in the residential, private or multi-space, the extended stay-at-home orders coupled with government incentives certainly contributed to homeowners using this time to work on their residences. And as far as social housing, affordable housing, the COVID lockdown measures really highlighted the housing inequalities that became obvious. And government incentives like the Victorian Big Housing Build, I think it's called, play a big part. So we're seeing some really interesting other categories of work being done, including government services, design review, defence, research facilities, and an expert witness. An expert witness is one that I'm particularly, curious about, which is quite revealing, possibly with increases in insurance claims and what have you.
Obviously, we're all experiencing what appears to be a very busy market. Everyone you speak to, every cafe you go into, there's signs at the front saying that there's a shortage of staff. Well, what's the Pulse Check said about the availability of people, and what are practices doing in terms of their own intentions with regards to hiring and otherwise?
It's busy. So, I guess that's the word that we're hearing a lot from the Pulse Check. It's busy. But it's busy probably for right and wrong reasons. It's heartening to see that 60% of the respondents, I think that's about 180 practices, have taken on new staff, with only 42 practices that have had to let people go, and that just accounts for close to 1,000 people,
Yeah.
which is a huge increase from the numbers reflected in the previous Pulse Check, which was done in May of last year. But it's not without difficulty. 70% responded that they had difficulty. A number commented on the challenges of finding staff, particularly in regional locations, and many point to the challenges of finding experienced mid-career and senior staff. And I think it might be quite useful maybe to go through some of the commentary, because I think that's
Sure.
where it kind of brings it to life. Many have talked about it's been really difficult to find staff, and that's which is really quite debilitating. They've been forced to knock back work, which is not ideal. Everyone's looking. So to your point about having these signposts on all these businesses looking for staff, but again, they're finding it hard to find the people. There's some sort of fractions talking about the fact that there's a lot of people out there, candidates, but it's about getting the right people with the right technical capability and capacity to deliver for the more and more complex projects that a lot of practices are taking on board. So, there seems to be the situation where, one could argue that there are plenty of candidates, but however, finding the the potential candidate with the right level of experience, the right capability, the requisite capacity, and above all, the right fit for the office has been deemed quite difficult. So, and especially if this is a kind of an immediate need, which it is. So practices and employers, if you don't have the time right now to train and upskill staff,
it's always an immediate need, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think you're right, and I think so. Just to kind of maybe summarise what we're seeing in that sort of staffing area is the main issues. Firstly, it's about getting the right fit, and that's technical capability, cultural fit. And it's going both ways. Employers are increasingly prioritising culture and well-being, and we'll talk about how that well-being has shifted too. And so they're seeking employees whose values align with them, and the reverse is also the case. Employees are seeking employers whose cultural and values align with theirs, and who are willing to pay for them at the asking rate. With reasonable parameters, of course.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing a big shift from both candidates and clients focusing on culture and values because it is so difficult to find staff. Businesses are looking for their own point of difference, and candidates are looking at where they're working as an extension of themselves. And if I'm going to work for somebody, I want to be rewarded in ways that are non-monetary as well.
Absolutely, and it's not always about the money.
No.
Right? There are other factors that are driving. All the statistics and the research that are done. That what is it that candidates are looking for in terms of job satisfaction, engagement, and remuneration. Is normally not at the top of the list. But,
anecdotally, we're also hearing about a lot of people who are moving to regional areas but wanting to commute into the city and doing 2 or 3 days in the country and then 2 or 3 days in the city. Is that something that came out of the Pulse Check?
Yes, indeed. We're also hearing, however, that if there is this sort of talent scarcity that's plaguing the metros, the regions are facing it almost tenfold.
Yes.
So it's interesting, there's this kind of movement, metro and regionals, but there is a problem in the regional areas. The reverse is happening. And I've been talking to actually a number of practices post the survey who are kind of saying this is the real problem because they're losing out.
Yeah, look, unfortunately, it's always been difficult to get staff into regional areas because and I grew up in Bendigo myself. Often you see people in regional areas moving to the city to seek more opportunity and a different lifestyle to what they've grown up with. And it's not until they get to a certain age that they look at returning or moving back home. But sometimes they never do. So it's always been difficult to get people into regional areas. And we've actually run a few programs ourselves with the Planning Institute to attract planners from the UK, and we've now placed a number of those in regional areas because the demand is so high there and the availability of staff is so low.
And I'd love to talk to you, further about that because, if this is going to be an ongoing issue, and we're kind of, at ACA trying to work out a regional practice strategy to understand, what are actually some of the issues that are happening in the regions and why is it that the attraction of staff is the way that it is. Having said that, there's also this other point to make, and that is, with technology and certainly over COVID, enabling that ability to be able to work anywhere, anytime, remotely, that could facilitate. So I mean, probably we're in the early stages of utilising it to its maximum, but but your point about maybe bringing overseas is something I'd love to explore more.
What are practices saying about, I suppose, retaining staff? Again, anecdotally, we're certainly hearing that the amount of headhunting from one practice to another is reaching extreme levels. Is that something that's come out of the Pulse Check?
Yes, some comments talk about poaching that's occurred. So when we think about, staff that have, and there's a question around staff leaving their own volition, a lot of it is about moving to practices that are offering, either better conditions or more interesting work is one that, so they're either larger practices. Yeah, remuneration definitely plays a part in that, but I think values, aligning. So it goes back to the kind of the cultural fit. So I think there's a bit of a spotlight on practices kind of, thinking more about, okay, well, what is it about my practice that's going to be that point of difference? It's, what can we do? Because we also know that with the Pulse Check survey, that with all the increases we're seeing in terms of expenses and costs not being matched by income, practices are quite hamstrung to offer, big bucks for staff. So there are other areas that need to be. So mentoring is another thing that, a lot of practices are looking at. And particularly to some of the comments around, potential graduates who may not have the right technical sort of skills, how do we upskill them? So mentoring, training, looking at culture, and.
Yeah, graduates and students is certainly an area of the market that I think has probably been affected most by COVID or the last 2 years anyhow, because a lot of practices did find it very, very difficult to mentor and develop those people when they're not in the office. And so how they go about offering appropriate training and engagement. And look, let's be honest, when you're a graduate or a student, it's fun going into work. That's the good bit of the job. It's making those connections and staying late at work and having a bit of fun and doing all those things that are the exciting parts of your early career, and you absorb so much from doing that. And COVID really did, I suppose, rob people of that opportunity.
It did. It did. In fact, with the survey, we've just sort of segued into the flexible working environment and hybrid, which I think it's timely because we sort of asked the question about hybrid and flexible working models, and we sort of fell into sort of three core areas. First was practices who sort of said that they were leveraging experiences during the pandemic to embed this kind of long-term flexibility. Others have said that they've been doing flexible workplace arrangements well before COVID pandemic. And the third cohort see flexibility as quite short-term or last resort. Or not working flexibly at all. And I think this is quite insightful, particularly the comments, where, and if I just talk through, so bear with me, Leigh, when I talk through, particular comments where practices offer flexibility, but most of their workforce would rather come to work, to your point, as they enjoy the studio collaboration, which to many is quite conducive to productivity, engagement, culture, well-being, just reflecting on architecture as a profession, it's a very collaborative profession. So it still needs to enable that working environment. We also know from the survey and just talking to our members, many practices are located not far from that home. So again, the ability to detach from, work from home is also appealing, with smaller practices preferring to work in the office if practicable. So, and some talk to your point, this incidental conversations, this incidental learnings that can happen, particularly for the younger architects in the office. So,
Is there a consensus starting to develop amongst the industry about what is the standard for hybrid working? Is it 3 days in, 2 days out, or is the flexibility itself very dependent on the organisation?
$1 million question, but I think you might have answered it yourself. I think and I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think the Pulse Check offered a range of examples of which practices we're using, but I think it was dependent on the practice itself and what's going to work for them. Often the sort of set rule, 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, may or may not work, but what I would suggest is this is about communication. This is about ongoing consultation with your teams both ways to work out what's going to work for you. And there's, obviously a range of models that have worked. In fact, ACA, we've launched a Stepping Up series in collaboration with Parlour and Champions of Change, where we're talking through a whole range of equity and practice issues, and flexibility is actually one big part of it. So happy to share that with you guys, because it talks about the why of flexibility, but also the what and when, and how do you actually make it work. It's publicly available, but what you learn is that that there's no one size fits all, and it's really about applying a very collaborative approach that's about communication.
And did practices report on what flexibility or hybrid working has done to their own productivity and those sort of broader business issues?
excited that it has been a real game changer in terms of productivity, because, again, flexibility, people are able to work at their time. So again, by increasing engagement in staff and, satisfaction, it leads to productivity. Others have felt that maybe it has not been as productive, and to the points that I raised earlier, because maybe in smaller practices, having people together, the collaborative environment, if you've had graduates coming in or students, that ability to be able to be in the office. So I think it's a little bit mixed, Leigh, to be honest, in terms of, and I think we're only just starting to see, it's only been 2 years in. I think it'll take a little bit more time for those metrics to be really, to come to life. But, again, there's absolute value, and we know the benefits of being able to offer hybrid and flexibility, but it needs to work for the business as it does for the individual.
Yeah, well, we're certainly seeing lots of different things being done by practices out there. So there are things like having certain staff in on certain days, or certain project teams in on certain days, or certain disciplines in on certain days, so that you can structure your normal kind of meetings and plan for, as much as you possibly can, plan for those sort of incidental conversations where you have the whole project team in on one day and everyone does all their meetings and all their team building and lunches, or after work drinks on the one day, so that everyone still gets that sort of exposure. Is that something that's sort of come through the report?
Yeah. Certainly. Having it based on projects, having minimum hours per week where it's mandatory, or, maybe 4 days in the office for grads, 3 days at home for others. And then, of course, there's, this whole idea about working through different models.
So obviously we're in a much more challenging world, and we've got the practice of architecture having to confront things that it's never had to confront before. So what have been the negatives that have come out of the Pulse Check? I mean, obviously, there's a huge section in the report there about just the mental well-being of architects. How's that been affected?
Well-being, one that we have specifically tracked right from the beginning, and at respondents rated that the overall well-being of practices are actually quite good, or not very good. So about 70% talk about it in that context, about 20% saying it's neutral, and the remainder saying that they're worried or very worried. But looking at the specific cohorts, the numbers start to shift somewhat. And in previous Pulse checks, senior management and employees juggling other commitments were the ones who have higher percentages in the slightly worrying and very worrying category.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's reflective of the nature of architecture we're seeing. The issues around timelines, deadlines, issues of fees, poor procurement practices, the burden of running an architectural practices. I mean, it's relentless. And so taking care of staff, focusing on staff, and maybe not enough of taking care of themselves, i.e. the directors and employers themselves, could be something. And in fact, in many ways, those findings are corroborated with the Monash University Wellbeing for Architects Research Project, which is this national project that you may not be aware of, but ACA is a partner on. It's the first of its kind.
I was actually going to ask you about that. Yeah, it sounds fantastic.
Yeah, and so it's it's something that was undertaken. Professor Naomi Stead has been running it while she was in Monash, and it's into looking at practitioners survey, and there's a whole bunch of data that we can go through maybe another time, but also students, and trying to establish for the first time ever all of the stuff that we've known about the mental health and well-being of architecture is kind of validated. And what's interesting, and what's interesting to our survey, is that the 4 key areas that are affecting kind of the practitioners of architecture it's around time management, so timelines, deadlines, overtime. The second is around financial management, so fees, salaries, big issue. The third's around the value, so the perceived value or lack of value of architecture in our communities, which is also impacting. When the fourth is, where's that structural action to kind of address all of these issues? And all of these issues are putting pressure on, staff. So, what we're talking about before, the inability to find these additional right resources, the unpredictability of COVID, with people getting sicker. And if not with COVID, like the flu, which is pretty bad this time around, and then the impact on children. So and for some of the larger practices, I mean, they've said that some are okay, others not so good, most are overworked. So it's quite varied, I think. But suffice to say, there are, the fatigue, the lack of engagement as a result, the low interest in taking on challenges is evident for many practices, and that's playing a really big part in the wellbeing levels of staff.
So with obviously all these mental health issues affecting the industry, what are practices doing about it? Are there best practice methods out there that people are discussing and working through as a collective?
Excellent question, Leigh, because last year the ACA, we rolled out a national architects mental wellbeing forum across the country. It was founded 4 years ago in the UK by an architect, Ben Shannon. And, when we were starting to have these conversations about the wellbeing of architects, anecdotally, observations coming through, we thought we needed to do something. So we established the Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum. And, really encouragingly, it's kind of grown across all of our states and branches. But part of the vision of doing this was not just about raising the awareness for practices to be aware that, there's some issues here with well-being, and it's not arising from one particular reason. There's multiple layers and layers, and it starts right from sort of university days through to practice. But also raising awareness, but also thinking about tools and resources. So we launched the Architects Mental Wellbeing Toolkit exactly 1 year ago, where it goes through kind of the 8 core topics that are contributing to wellbeing. So how do we care for graduates and interns? What are kind of the support systems that need to be used? How do we deal with the overtime, the long hours culture? So so there are toolkits out there, and we are going to start this kind of series where we bring the toolkit to life through webinars and editorial pieces. And in talking to practices, one of the things that they've fed back to us is the toolkit. It's been really, really useful for them to start engaging with their staff, bearing in mind that practices aren't health experts, they're not wellbeing experts, so and leveraging other providers and experts such as the employee assistance program, so trying to establish those in practice, and really deferring it to other practice to the experts. And something else that a lot of practices have been doing is also engaging with the mental health training, first aid training, which is kind of like your first aid for mental well-being. So there are multiple ways in which we're all kind of banding together and trying to work out what's what can be done. But I think it comes down to understanding that there are support services out there, reaching out to certainly providers that are offering those services. So the EAP services are amazing, and having constant conversations with their peers to learn from each other.
What are the other challenges that the practices are reporting that they've identified as facing the industry at the moment? Is there anything else that's particularly pressing?
Just, I guess, in terms of time, if we think about drilling down some of those challenges, and I know that just in terms of some of the areas that they've cited in the Pulse Check survey, the most common challenges, related to higher than usual rates of illness, followed by the upward pressure on salaries, not commensurate with increased income. That's actually quite a massive one. Difficulties attracting experienced staff, exhaustion. But so drilling them down, it's not enough time to mentor and support staff. The younger staff, missing out on informal learning, and we've talked about that a lot. And valued staff leaving on their own volition to pursue other opportunities. And also, and I touched on this earlier, the senior staff struggling to manage hybrid teams. Again, it's not a new phenomenon, it's the hybrid flexible, but it's still a challenge. To many, it's still a change, rightly or wrongly. And, some respondents have also talked about the benefits of working flexibly, but also the increased expectations, and in some cases, pressure from staff to work remotely, but the challenges that some face in measuring focus and productivity or profitability in the longer term. So I know you and I have talked about it, just about measuring that productivity. So I think time will tell.
But finally, the issue of salaries. There's a sense that, and one comment also captured it well, is that the profession is so competitive on time and fees that it's difficult to offer adequate remuneration for professional staff and reasonable timeframes to achieve that high level of quality that's demanded of the profession.
And unfortunately, fees has been such a big issue for the industry for 20 years. Every time there's a slowdown or there's an issue in the market, fees get hit, and they almost never respond. So there's just this constant pressure on architectural practices to be more efficient, to be able to do more for less, and eventually it's going to be a breaking point. They can't always be more efficient. It's there's an end point where you can't do any more to be productive and to get the work out.
Is spot on. In fact, I think it's a lovely segue into some of the opportunities that we're seeing, because you're right. The fees. I mean, we've heard this for decades now, and we can talk about it, but it's interesting because in this particular survey, we thought we'd ask about opportunities identified, which we hadn't done in the past, and many talked about the chance to rethink how they practice, and the potential to be more selective about the projects taken on. Again, we've had this conversation for some time now, and members telling us that saying no is actually, or walking away from projects, it is hard, and but yet if you don't walk away, it's potentially the risk of compromising the integrity.
To do it,
and worth, exactly. So, but knowing that now that this time has given people to kind of go, hang on, wait a minute, maybe I need to rethink, how we practice and how we can be more selective with projects. So, interesting.
Yeah, it's funny. It's a conversation that I tend to have quite regularly, and whenever practices seem to be turning around their fortunes, a vigorous no-go or go process on submissions actually seems to play a really important part in that, because you can lose a lot of money pitching for work that you weren't going to make money on in the first place.
Oh, yes. We've heard that too. And a lot of that IP going into that submission, sometimes unnecessarily.
And sometimes that IP turns up in the project anyway. So yeah, exactly. So what are the other opportunities? Where are we going? What are the things to look forward to?
So look, the other thing too, again, no surprises, hybrid workplace models, that's something that I think, is now the new norm, possibly the future, but just refining it, what's working well. Because again, not a one size fits all, but it's on the table now. Fair Work have got it in, as part of legislation and practices that go above and beyond their legislative obligations, obviously practice of choice. And also we found, this has been a time for a lot of practices and directors and employees to learn new skills, new technologies, and that I think a lot of people can add to their CVs. And respondents have said this, we've learned a great deal from the pandemic. Other interesting comments include we've taken a lot of time to work on the business side of the practice during the pandemic, and that's music to ACA's ears, because obviously, the business of architecture that we are, taking that time to really think about, your business. And this has for many led to, not many, but, those that have responded, increase in profit margins, new work opportunities, and, an opportunity to also employ, as you say, staff interstate, working remotely, which is great, because seeing that we've got this labour shortage in the regions, quite heavily. And and I think all this suggests that there's definitely an appetite to not let this crisis, this pandemic, go to waste or get in the way of new and improved ways of working. So so we've seen some good things come through it, but it's still obviously some way to go. But it's encouraging to see that people are reframing some of their mindsets.
Fantastic. And if people want to read the Pulse Check in more detail, or they would like to reach out to you and the organisation directly, where can they find you?
They can find us on our website, www.aca.org.au. We will be doing a bit more work around a longitudinal report that will culminate all the Pulse Check surveys, because I think it's important now that we've got the 6 Pulse Check that's quite detailed, to kind of wrap it around and go, this is what we're seeing. So stay tuned for that. So aca.org.au.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Angelina. It's been lovely to speak to you.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.